returns a part of the web page to the client, and the client then integrates that into the existing web page. Probably the best example we can give to that is from our friends at Google. As I start typing, it starts to give me recommendations. And the more that I type, the more specific those recommendations become. Let's think about this. And let's convince ourselves that something funny is going on here. All right? Something outside of the norm is going on here. First of all, as I'm typing, does the page completely refresh? No. You don't see the flicker. This stuff stays the same. Even on a fast connection, if you click refresh, you'll see the page, disappear and then reappear. So that page isn't being completely refreshed every time I type something in. So this is not the traditional model of going to the server and returning back some data, all right, and displaying a complete web page. However, you might say, well, gee, maybe all of this is happening on the client side then. Maybe when this page was downloaded, it included a gigantic JavaScript that can go and do these recommendations for me. Well, let's think about that. That's very, very, very unlikely, right? Because, again, without knowing the details of it, it's pretty clear that something is talking to a database, right? There's not a hard-coded list of every possible term that you could search for that gets sent down to the client. That's impractical, right? Likewise, it's impractical and just plain not a good idea to allow the client to try to connect to the database. Even if they could do that, you wouldn't want them to be able to do that. Therefore, it's doing database interactivity, therefore, the server must be involved. So we have a paradox, right? The page isn't completely refreshing, all right, which implies that the server isn't involved, and yet we're clearly accessing a database, which implies that the server is involved. So what's going on? Well, the client and server are simply interacting in a non-typical way. And by typical, I mean where the client requests a page and the server sends back a complete page. That's what happens on the initial load of the page, all right? But what happens for each subsequent key press is that it's only sending back portions of the page, and the client then updates the page to include that. You can see this all over Google. This is one example. If you go to Google Maps, there's another good example of this. We go to this page, for example, and we search for Lorain County Community College. We switch to satellite view. Notice none of that's flickering. It's loading something from the server to be sure, but not a whole page. I scroll. You can almost see at a certain point the client knows where it doesn't have the image and knows what to ask the server for. And the server is responding just with that new image. So this is another example of Ajax where the whole page isn't being refreshed. The server's just being asked for a piece of data, being asked for an image when it needs it. All right? So what does this have to do with ASP.NET? It has this to do with ASP.NET. Let's go in here real quick. There's actually, to accomplish Ajax in ASP.NET is actually pretty simple. You just need to do a couple things. my website. I'm not really going to put anything in it. I just want to show you the tools that are involved. Go to Design View. Tools that you have are available in a special section, which are the Ajax extensions. Okay? Now, there's any number of these that you could use, but there's two of them that you absolutely have to use to Ajaxify your page. First one is the script manager. You need that script manager on your page, so you drag it over. All right. The other thing that you need is you need an update panel. All right. Now, we've used panels before, right? What do we use panels for? We use panels to just sort of group stuff together. Why do we group things together? Well, we group things together for one thing to make it easy to show and hide stuff. All right? You could, for example, retrieve all the information. One way to do the automobile exercise, this would be a pretty cool way to do it, would be to have a panel for the car information and a panel for the maintenance information. And then links where you could just switch back and forth and make the one panel visible, make the other panel visible. So that's one way you could have done that example, which would have been pretty neat. But it allows you to group things together so you can treat them as a unit. Now, in the case of an Ajax application, everything in the Ajax update panel that we're going to put in here is going to be handled as Ajax functionality. So if I put in there a grid view, let's say, that retrieve data from a certain table. I won't go through the, we all know how to do that. If I put on here a grid view that retrieved data from a database table, and I put in here a text box that allowed you to enter in a name and do a search, and a button to go in and actually do the search. If I put those in an update panel, then those will be handled as an Ajax request. In other words, when I press the button, it would not refresh the whole page. It would just refresh that panel. All right? So, very easy way, and those of you that have had or will have or are taking CISS243, will say, geez, that's all you have to do? And it is. The framework allows you to do that very easily. So again, anything inside a panel is considered to be Ajax functionality, and therefore it will treat it as such. And it will not refresh the entire page. Instead, it will refresh just that panel. All right? And it handles all that for you. All right? So it would be very easy if you wanted to practice on your own to take any of your examples, add the script manager, add the update panel, and go and put one of your searches inside of it. And it should make it an Ajax, Ajax functionality. And you should be able to see how the page doesn't refresh, just the portion of it. All right. The last thing I want to talk about today is, do the initials MVC mean anything to anyone?
Manage content view.
Close. MVC. It's not most valuable coder or most valuable computer. It stands for Model View Controller. All right. Now, one of the principles of this class has been that to the degree that you can keep stuff separate, the better off you're going to be from a maintainability perspective, right? Going back to CISS243, right? We separated our CSS from our HTML. Why? We could change one without messing up the other. And we could apply one to many different pages, and you don't have to repeat the litany of reasons why that's a good idea. Then we went into creating a page which represented the visual aspects of our web page, and a code behind which represented sort of our processing logic. And then we even abstracted it one step further and created a custom object, a custom class for tuition, I think it was, where we go in and we can put some code in there and reuse that across the board. Again, we separated those things, the appearance, the business logic, and so on. The model view controller framework extends that thinking even further. All right? And the model view controller framework is not exclusively an ASP.NET thing. It's what's called a design pattern. One of the complaints about software developers is that software developers, especially in the past, were more like blacksmiths or artisans than manufacturers and assembly lines. In other words, every program was sort of custom crafted, just like a blacksmith might custom craft a wagon wheel. Keep in mind, I'm not speaking from personal experience here. All right? I'm not quite that old where I remember blacksmiths. I'm just, saw a lot of cowboy movies. All right. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is everything, you are literally, almost, reinventing the wheel. If you're not reinventing the wheel, you're remanufacturing the wheel or re-engineering the wheel or something like that. Here's what design patterns say. Design patterns say something like this. The philosophy behind design patterns is that, hey, look, don't kid yourself into thinking that your software development project is unique and it's the only problem in the world that looks like that. There might be some stuff that's specific to your project, to be sure, right? That's why it's not just a generic project. Your organization does have some unique characteristics, but the overall pattern is the same. I guess a rough analogy could be that, buildings follow a certain design pattern, right? Buildings have walls, roofs, windows, heating, air conditioning, ventilation. They have these sort of common things, all right? That doesn't mean that every building looks the same. Every building can look wildly different. But they all sort of start with a certain pattern of how a building is. There have been, again, several of these design patterns defined that say, take a look at your problem and see if it fits one of these scenarios. And a common scenario, and one that applies to just about any situation, and keep in mind it isn't like, well, this is the one we're going to use. You can use a bunch of different design patterns for a bunch of different pieces of your application. But sort of the one that overall architect your site is the MVC, or Models View Control. There was a good chart on Wikipedia that shows this. And the Models View Control is a framework that says this. Here you have your client. That would be someone running a web browser in our case. You could consider the little cloud being here and the gray box being the web server, and this being the database server. All right? The client interacts with a controller. That controller takes views and sends it to the client, and takes requests from the client and goes through the models to interact with the database. The view is the user interface. The view is what the user sees and interacts with. All right? The model represents the data entities, the storage of the data, and the business rules that apply to that data. I guess this would be similar to, but not the same thing, but similar to the custom class that we developed where it had business rules. So we have user interface, business rules, and data access, and we have a controller that is sort of the ringmaster, handling communication between all the different components, whether it be the client, the view, the model, and so on. All right? Now, how is this different than traditional ASP.NET? All right? Wow, again, traditional ASP.NET. That, by the way, is called using web forms, what I just termed as traditional ASP.NET, because we created web forms every time we wanted to interact with the database, or every time we wanted to create a page. What's bad about web forms is we can have stuff like SQL statements embedded right into our user interface, right? If you look at your page that pulls up a list of all the automobiles in the automobile table, you will see inside your ASPX file a SQL statement. Your ASPX file is meant to be the user interface, and yet there is SQL logic inside of that. From a programming purist, that's a bad thing, because we haven't achieved enough separation between those. With this model, we achieve much more separation. The user interface is just that. It's just a user interface. It's just the visual components that the user will interact with. The model contains the business rules and the data access and the accessing of the database, and the controller sort of ties that all together. Web forms, in a way, sort of implement some of these ideas, right? For example, we have our SQL data source objects inside our view. All right, so it's separated a little bit, but it's not as separated as it could be. All right, not as clean of a separation as there could be. And this architecture allows us to do this. All right, I would guess over time this will be a more and more popular way of developing ASP.NET applications. But this is a good, worthwhile topic to consider. And if you want to study ASP.NET more, this might be one thing to work through some of the sample applications that you find online. You know, there's a lot of samples that you can find online or in books for this. But if you want to continue what you're learning in this class, this will be a good way to do it. And also, it would be good from a competitive perspective if you're looking for a job. Because if you're looking for a job and you've done ASP.NET, both using web forms and with Models View Controller, that would be a nice little feather in your cap. All right. At some point, we may teach that in this class, but we're not doing it this semester, and we're not doing it next semester. So we will revisit that problem over the summer and decide if this is the approach to take. This is paradoxically both more complicated and simpler than web forms, if that makes any sense. There's aspects of it that are more complicated. You have to set up more files, right? Because now, gee, instead of having 2 files for each page, we got effectively, it's not really, you're not really comparing apples to apples, but you got 3 things. Instead of a code behind and a ASPX page, you have a model, you have a controller, and you have a view. All right. That wraps that up. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording.